During the reign of Augustus from 31 BC to 14 AD, senators, artists, authors, and others fell over themselves to show their allegiance to the regime. This sycophancy seems to have increased after 20 BC, the year Augustus finally got his so-called victory against the Parthian kingdom in Persia. In reality, as we discussed last time, Parthia just returned some military standards, some prisoners of war, and added a bit of cash considerations. But Augustus made it seem like he had conquered the Parthian Empire itself, personally, a long-awaited sign of divine approval. But despite Augustus's attempt to project his reign as unquestioned and unifying, he in fact faced rebellion in many forms, from the culture to conspiracies. And as we'll see today, some of these were even rumored to have involved his own family members, even his own wife. The Augustan regime had some amazing highs. But if we look closer, we see the cracks in its glorious facade. And so begins this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 8, The End of the Age of Augustus. Augustus's reign was probably at its most fragile in the years before Parthia returned the battle standards, 23, 22 BC, those years. And what was going on to make that such a difficult time? Well, there were several years of famine in Rome, and that includes grain shortages. These shortages in the late 20s BC were the first that we know of since Augustus was called Octavian and ruled as triumvir and was the man who was prescribing and killing people. And there's no doubt that the grain shortages in the late 20s reminded people of those times. But now things were even worse because in addition to the famines, a pestilence swept through Rome. It killed livestock as well as people. And even worse, the river that ran through Rome, the Tiber, flooded, and it contaminated the lowlands in the city of Rome. It swept away houses, leading to even more deaths. And in the midst of all of this, Augustus himself became sick, and apparently was so sick that many expected him to die. And we don't have details of the sickness, because of course to record those details would be a passive form of questioning the regime. Again, not the last time that a political leader's declining health is ignored by the people who we might expect to report on such things. So all we really know is that Augustus was sick, and then he miraculously recovered. But this sickness put a scare into the people around Augustus, and the people in his inner circle began to wonder what his plans were for the day that he would eventually die. And at least some of these people decided they were going to accelerate that process. And again, we don't know the details, but there was a conspiracy hatched against Augustus. All we know is that it wasn't successful, the conspirators were tried, and that they apparently were close to him. But again, the sycophants around Augustus were unwilling to report details that would undermine the credibility of the regime. And so the history books are almost entirely silent. But then, as we learned last time, Augustus had a breakthrough. Parthia returned the military standards. And Augustus made a huge deal of that and used the momentum to pass moral legislation and then to hold the secular games where he was put at the center of Roman religion. He also convinced many poets and songwriters and artists, some of them of course were paid, to join with the government to promote both this broader ideology and also these specific laws that regulated sexual behavior and encouraged marriage and reinforced traditional male and female roles and rewarded childbearing. But not every artist was on board with the message. There were counter-narratives, and these were propagated by elite men who decided to go against the ideal elite lifestyle that Augustus desired for them. Military service, service in the courts, and then a political career. And instead, these men did something that was in some ways quite unexpected. They wrote love poetry. And this undermined Augustus in two ways. First, what I just said. Here are elite men not doing what they're supposed to do, not doing manly things, fighting wars and so on. But also the topic of their poetry ended up being quite scandalous, anti-marriage, and full of innuendo. In other words, the content of these poems directly undermined Augustus's attempts to impose his vision of morality onto elites and to present that image as universally held by elites. This poetry was called Roman elegy, and it only flourished during the age of Augustus. As soon as he's gone, it goes away. It was a unique form of rebellion in the midst of a unique age. This poetry valorized infidelity. These men openly spoke about courting married women. Quote, "I was idle, born to leisure, barely clothed, mind softened by lazy scribbling in the shade, but love for a pretty girl soon drove the sluggard to action, made him join up. And just look at me now, fighting fit, dead keen on night exercises. If you want a cure for slackness, fall in love." That's one of Ovid's Amores. Now, that's one of the least salacious poems that I could find. I want to keep this podcast PG at best. And you can search for Ovid or Propertius or some of the other elegiac poets if you want to read more. But I mention Ovid specifically because either his poetry or his interactions perhaps with Augustus's inner circle caused him to fall afoul of Augustus's notorious temper. And in 8 AD, Ovid was banished from the city of Rome. Historians don't know the extent to which Ovid's racy poems were responsible. Ovid just left one mysterious comment about why it was that Augustus was so angry with him. He said it was because of, quote, "a poem and a mistake." But coincidentally, several of Augustus's family members and friends were banished at the exact same time. And this grouping has led some historians to wonder if Ovid was part of a second conspiracy against Augustus. Again, one which does not survive to make the history books. So let's go back to what we can know. You'll remember that Augustus held the secular games in 16 BC. Augustus had firmly entrenched himself in the center of Roman religious life. And then, right after this, he leaves Rome. Why does he do this? Well, in the province of Gaul, Celtic warriors had streamed over the Rhine River and were assaulting Roman soldiers in the province. And so Augustus left to personally inspire those soldiers. He also helped lead the effort to improve the defenses on that border. And it's a good thing that he did, because the Rhine River, along with the Danube River, would be major incursion points into the Roman Empire, probably its leakiest borders. Now, for most of the Pax Romana, those borders were secure. But the Pax Romana was bookended by major military activity in that region. Under Augustus, an army of Germans would inflict a jarring defeat on Roman soldiers on the German border. Historians believe around 20,000 Roman soldiers died in this battle, which would be known as the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. The Romans were ambushed and killed by German troops led by a German named Arminius, who was formerly an ally and citizen of Rome. And with that defeat, the Romans would not again attempt to control territory beyond the Rhine River until the very end of the Pax Romana under the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. And we'll talk about that near the end of this podcast series. But back in 13 BC, that shattering defeat was still well into the future, and Augustus's 3-year project on the German border was basically successful. And so he returned to Rome that year in 13 BC. And it had been 3 years, and the Roman Senate, which had been completely habituated to finding its purpose in fawning over Augustus, are so overjoyed that Augustus had returned to Rome and given them something to do again, that they just start heaping honors again onto Augustus. And probably the most significant of these was a massive altar to the Augustan peace. It's called the Ara Pacis, or the Altar of Peace. And this altar still stands in Rome to this day. It's so large that it's like a room without a ceiling. You can actually walk into the altar and look at all of the different panels and images on it. It has its own museum, for goodness sake. And the images are fascinating. They propagate the Augustan ideology. Images like a matronly goddess with children at her breasts, or bountiful harvests of wheat and healthy-looking livestock, war spoils, scenes from Augustus's ancestors in Rome's mythical past. But probably the most interesting scene on the altar is a carved procession of Augustus being followed by family members and friends and members of the Senate. And this is a scene which would have been important at the time because it effectively showed who was favored by the new regime, both in a general sense, but the scene also may serve to identify what is meant to happen when Augustus departs permanently, that is, when Augustus dies. Now, in 13 BC, nobody probably thought Augustus was going to die anytime soon. He was 50 years old, which isn't young, but it's not elderly either. But Augustus had faced several sicknesses and at least one plot on his life. And many people wanted to know what was going to happen when Augustus died. And from Augustus's perspective, he couldn't simply act like a monarch and just dictate some kind of succession plan. Part of the whole illusion of his government was to nominally restore the republic. And so it was kind of an open question. Were the different powers that Augustus held unique to him, and therefore they would die with him? And if that was the case, what would happen? Would all the pieces of power that he accumulated into himself just fall back apart and default back to the various Republican officials that they were taken from? Or could, in fact, this package of power be passed on to some kind of successor? And if so, how would that person or persons be identified? So Augustus needed to indicate what his plans were without being too heavy-handed about it. He needed to cover those plans in some traditions. And Augustus would find those traditions in his own life, in the way that Julius Caesar's legacy and name were passed on to him. And the circumstances were good for this kind of approach because, like Caesar, Augustus did not have a natural son. His wife, Livia, had sons from a previous marriage, but she never bore Augustus any children, despite 51 years of marriage. Augustus shows some preference for Livia's son, Tiberius, but at least early on, he doesn't seem to fit, at least directly, into any succession plan. Instead, Augustus prefers his own bloodline. But again, he doesn't have a son, so he uses his daughter, Julia. He has Julia marry his best friend and loyal general, Agrippa. Agrippa is adopted as Augustus's son, and coins would show Agrippa on one side and Augustus on the other, just like coins that showed Octavian on one side and Julius Caesar on another. So we have that same tradition being used to signal a preference for Agrippa. Now, Agrippa may have been intended as the designated heir all along. Certainly, he would accumulate over time many of the same powers that Augustus held. But the succession plan became even clearer when Agrippa and Julia began to produce sons. The first two of these sons were born fairly close to each other. Gaius was born in 20 BC, and Lucius was born in 17 BC. And Augustus decided to adopt both those boys as his sons. And here we're seeing what adoption is doing. Because for practical purposes, there's no need to adopt those grandchildren. They are already in Augustus's line by blood. But adoption is clearly more than that. Adoption is signifying the passing on of Augustus's name and his inheritance and probably his power. The adoption signals Agrippa is first in line, Gaius, and then Lucius after him. So even though Augustus wasn't outright saying it, He was using adoption to establish what was effectively a kind of modified monarchy. But very quickly, Augustus's plans for succession hit a snag. Agrippa unexpectedly died just 1 year after the altar of peace was dedicated, in the year 12 BC. Agrippa left behind his 2 older sons, Gaius and Lucius, and his wife Julia was still pregnant at the time. So after Agrippa had died, she then gave birth to his 3rd son, who was appropriately named Agrippa Posthumus, because of course he was born after his father died. Now, despite Agrippa's death, Augustus still preferred that line of succession. But the boys were not yet independent. They needed a father figure to help usher them through the final years into manhood. And Augustus had a man in mind who could fill that role. It was his stepson, Tiberius. And so maybe without thinking of the consequences, Augustus commanded Tiberius to divorce his wife. But what Augustus may not have known, or maybe just not cared about, was that Tiberius was deeply in love with his wife. So many Roman marriages were marriages of convenience, but the sources suggest that Tiberius loved his wife and that divorcing her brought him tremendous pain, and sent him into a marriage now with Julia, Augustus's daughter and Agrippa's widow, that was basically a loveless marriage. And Tiberius very quickly grew despondent and disinterested in Augustus's plans for him, despite the fact that Augustus heaped upon him a variety of honors, gave Tiberius military commands, consulships, even gave him bodily sacrosanctity, just like Augustus had had. But despite these prizes, Tiberius just did not get over the divorce, and eventually decided that he could not bear to stay in Rome when he could not be with the woman that he loved. Tiberius left the city of Rome, and he went to Rhodes in basically a self-imposed exile. He retired entirely for politics, and this was the second big blow to Augustus's succession plans. So Tiberius was now gone, and Augustus turned to supervising Lucius and Gaius directly. And we see in the imperial propaganda around this time a preference for those 2 boys on the coinage. Their images are put on Roman coins, and they're given certain titles that suggest a kind of inevitability that they will someday lead Rome. Titles like Princes of the Youth and Future Consuls. Gaius would enter manhood first, and on the year that he became a man, he was elected consul. And both Gaius and Lucius were also enrolled in the Senate as well. But then the 3rd snag happened. Julia, the boy's mother, in a loveless marriage with a husband that had left the city of Rome and essentially abandoned her, falls into a series of adulterous relationships. And Augustus, of course, needs his family, of all people, to uphold his moral legislation. Can't have a daughter that's openly flaunting his own laws and expect senators to obey that law as well. So Augustus imposes the penalties required by the law and exiles his own daughter. And he seems to have been pretty furious with her because he chose to exile her to a tiny island in the Mediterranean, just a half square mile in surface area. A couple of years go by and Lucius enters manhood as well. It's the year 2 BC. And at this point, Tiberius seems ready to re-enter Roman political life. But Augustus sends word to Tiberius and essentially says, "You've forsaken your family and your duty. Don't bother coming back to Rome." But Tiberius would benefit from a tragedy for Augustus. In the year 2 AD, the eldest of Augustus's grandchildren, Gaius, he was now 22 years old, and Lucius was 18. Lucius, however, who by all appearances was a healthy young man, became inexplicably ill. And at that exact same time, Tiberius began making his way back to Rome. The Roman sources begin to wonder at some strange coincidences. Tiberius returning to Rome, Lucius would die. and now Augustus had just two potential heirs left: Gaius, the eldest of Agrippa's children, and Postumus, the youngest. And as it turns out, just 2 years later, now Gaius, 23 years old, would take a wound on a military expedition in the east. And on his way back to Italy, that wound would fester. Gaius became very ill and ends up dying before ever seeing Rome again. The Roman senator Tacitus, who kept track of some of the rumors that circulated at the time of these deaths, gives us a sense of the conspiracy theories that were floating around Rome. Quote, after Agrippa had died, first Lucius and then Gaius met with premature natural deaths, unless their stepmother Livia had a secret hand in them. Lucius died on his way to the armies in Spain, Gaius while returning from Armenia, incapacitated by a wound. Amid this sort of conversation, the health of Augustus deteriorated. Some suspected his wife of foul play. That's Tacitus's Annals. In this desperate situation, Augustus forgives Tiberius, brings him back into the fold, and even adopts him as his son. And Tiberius, in turn, adopted his nephew, Germanicus, as his son. So that's one line of succession that's open to Augustus, although not a preferred one. Augustus still also has Agrippa's third son, Agrippa Postumus. And Augustus does adopt him as a son at this time as well. But very quickly that relationship sours. As Postumus turns 18, Augustus finds himself increasingly disappointed in him. And eventually a rift develops between the two of them. It became so great that Augustus eventually rescinds the adoption, and he sent Postumus into exile. So now it's just Tiberius. And Tiberius responded well. He threw himself into soldiering. He led victorious armies along the German border. But as Tacitus says, Augustus's health was declining at the same time. And by the year 14 AD, Augustus was over 70 years old and eventually bedridden. His wife Livia realized that Augustus was probably not going to survive the year, and so she recalled her son Tiberius back to Italy. Tacitus tells us what he suspects happened. Quote, when Tiberius arrived, it's unknown whether he found Augustus alive or dead, for the house and neighboring streets were carefully sealed by Livia's guards. At intervals, hopeful reports were published until the steps demanded by the situation had been taken. Then two pieces of news became known simultaneously. Augustus was dead, and Tiberius was in control. That's Tacitus's Annals. Augustus, the man who began his political career as the unexpected heir to Julius Caesar, the man who then marched on Rome and forged an alliance between himself, Mark Antony, and Lepidus, and then defeated those two men along with Cleopatra to take sole power in Rome and rule for 4 decades. That man had finally died. And maybe his wife killed him, but I think he probably died of old age. Much of what Tacitus says, I think, could be safely dismissed as rumor and speculation, but not everything. We're told by 2 ancient sources that Augustus, right before he became bedridden, attempted to make a visit, perhaps to reconcile with Agrippa Postumus, his last surviving grandson. And maybe even that visit would result in Postumus being readopted into the family, and thus introducing an unforeseen competitor to Tiberius. The conspiracy theory is that Livia stopped this from happening by poisoning her own husband. And while I'm not sure that that is true, what is undisputably true is that right after Augustus died, an assassin was sent to the place where Agrippa Postumus was exiled, and Augustus's grandson was murdered. This was a death that looked like a dynastic murder. This murder was unquestionably beneficial to the regime. And so we just have to wonder. Tiberius needed to establish that he was in control immediately, and that's what happened. Tiberius became Rome's second emperor. But as we'll learn next time, Tiberius was no Augustus. In fact, very quickly, Tiberius's old reluctance and absenteeism would return. He disengaged with politics. And with so much about this new imperial government still undefined and unclear, there was plenty of scope for men to try their luck at ruling while the emperor was away. And we'll talk about some of those men on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.